Okay. Thanks for joining, everyone. Appreciate it. The first thing I want to just go through a couple of club items, and I know Brian, you're driving, it appears, but I wanted to mention. So I don't know if you can talk or not, but I'll mention Brian's running a competition here in the end of August called the Great Head Throwdown and Efficiency Challenge, and so for that competition, I mean, if you're going to want to enter that and ship beers out, then you're probably going to be want to be, on your way to brewing beers for that right now. So, Brian, I don't know if you have the details on where people need to ship that those bottles to, how many bottles they need to ship, and all the particulars. Hold on. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I'm just requesting 2 bottles, and I don't want to exactly put my address out there, just for the public. So if people just kind of message me, gluten-free beer Brian, then I can give them the shipping information, or if they come to the event at Rolling Mills on August 22nd, they can just drop them off there to me.
And when do they need to get bottles to you by for the cutoff? What's the cutoff date?
No, the 22nd of August.
22nd of August? Okay.
Yeah. Right. We ended up having to push that event. So I'm like, we'll just push the date. And, the way 2020 is going, things will happen. It just, we have to adjust time frames a lot.
Yeah, understood. Okay, so we just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that competition that Brian's created, and there's some prizes that you worked with gluten-free home brewing with Brian Kolodensky as well, right? So maybe you can mention that.
Yes, we've got that going. I'm gonna make a couple of my t-shirts for it, and some swag, and there's something else. Oh god, I just forgot it. Anyway, oh yeah, I've got I'm compiling a list of. I've got a couple of gluten-free beer drinkers that were into the craft beer scene and did some judging. I think one, I forget what his credential was. I don't think he was a judge, but he's some kind of credential with beer. And I'm working on getting with one of the homebrew groups, which of course it's hard right now because they can't do meetings just yet, or it's real kind of sketchy. What's going to happen between now and the end of the summer. But I did a big brew event yesterday, and there's a couple people there that were interested. I mean, they're home brewers, so at the very least, they're proficient in tasting beer and throwing back some, critiques. And they were tasting that last beer I made, and really it was overall positive that they had to say. Turns out I made a hobby blonde, not an IPA though. So, we're gonna have more than just my bad palate to taste these beers and give everyone feedback.
Nice. So we'll try to put the word out more so people can get involved in that, and hopefully you get a bunch of entries for that. So that's great. Let's see, a couple other things that we have going on. Stuart, I don't think Stuart's on today, but Stuart and I had been working through creating a wiki to go along with the Facebook group, and Stuart's actually got quite a bit of information that he already has in his own personal database, and so we're going to look to start doing that over the next couple months, and so look for that to come online within the next couple months. Our inspiration, if you've never been to the site, is the Milk the Funk Facebook page, which also has associated wiki to it. The problem what we find with the Facebook page is that a lot of the information that you can't really find a lot of the information once it disappears from the more recent posts, right? So that's a little bit tough. So we wanted to create that to have a better resource for the gluten-free brewing community to access. Another thing that is happening is that we're going to try to work with the Brewers Association, the BJCP, and get in touch with those folks to try to create a dedicated um, category for gluten-free beers that are entered into homebrew competitions. So as of today, there's only the 31A category that really fits to the gluten-free beers, but that includes all alternative grain type of beers, and we want to get our own category for that. And it's interesting because the Brewers Association, the style guides that they use for um, the competitions like the GABF, they actually have a dedicated gluten-free category. So we're kind of just looking to use that as a guide for the BJCP. So another thing that's awesome is that we're nearing 1,000 members. So I'm pretty excited about that. We're about 8 people short of 1,000 members. So thanks to everyone that's joined over the past couple of years. That's pretty awesome. There we go. Let's get to that. The last thing before we get in to talking to Jim is that next month's meeting is going to be a recipe creation special, and I've got Brian Kolodensky from homebrewing.com to be going over guidelines and best practices when it comes to making recipes with gluten-free grains.
Nice.
Yeah. So we've got a special guest today, and that's Jim Eckert from Eckert Malting and Brewing. And thank you so much, Jim, for joining us. And we want to keep it pretty informal, right? I have a bunch of questions, and I know we talked recently that we wanted to go through some kind of main topics. But if anyone has any specific questions that they want to ask, I'm sure that we can just go off on tangents and do that. So thank you, Jim, for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. Look forward to this.
Yeah, and so Jim, can you just give us kind of an overview of the kind of basics, the who, what, when, where are you located? I think everyone knows you do just rice malt, right? Is it a dedicated gluten-free category? Where you're located, when you started, and things like that?
Yeah, so I think we're at approximately 8 years or so since this whole thing got started. Most of you have probably read my story, which is my wife determined she was gluten intolerant and started cutting things out of her diet. And beer was the last thing cut out of her diet. And it was a bad day on earth. And then she went out and found a gluten-free beer. I don't mention it in my story, but it was Redbridge. She brought home a 6-pack and she was just thrilled as anything until she took the first sip. And she put that beer down and she shoved it away from her and she said, I don't ever want to see that again. And we still have most of that 6-pack down in the basement. No one will drink it. It's probably bad by now. Anyway, she then went out and found another brand and brought it home with a little bit more skeptical look, and she got the same distance into that beer and she pushed it aside. She said, no, that's it. I'm not a beer drinker anymore. And she was drinking wine and she said, be a wine drinker. But she really likes a beer when she wants a beer. And so she eventually got right in my face and she said, well, you're a home brewer. Brew me a gluten-free beer that I like. And I went, yeah, right. That's not possible. And then I started looking at it and I got what I could find easily, which was some brown rice syrup. And I made a quote unquote beer. It ended up being very thin, alcohol water with very little character. And she was thrilled. I was not. And I said, okay, I'll brew one more batch of this. And I'm never going to do that again. So I brewed a second batch and then I started playing around with roasting, because I actually was working in the rice industry and had access to lots of rice. And I just figured, well, I know how to malt. I did a little bit when I was in college. I realized it didn't pay for barley. It was interesting, but there's no way I spent way too much time to produce a little bit of product, and it wasn't superior to what I could buy, so there was no point. But I figured I'd try it with rice, and luckily I did not look at a couple of publications that said it's not possible. And I just dove into it, and finally started malting in 5-gallon buckets in my kitchen, and then doing all the roasting in my gas oven, smoking up the house multiple times with the different roasts. My darkest roast was the most problematic because I filled the house with smoke. But I started, brewing, and then realized that I couldn't find any information that anybody had a commercial operation. And I just went, this is maybe my one opportunity to do something really stupid, and just go for it. And so I started maneuvering for it, and I started a Facebook page before I had an operation going, and I got a cold call from a guy in Canada, Gambrinus Malting up there, and they said, "Oh, you're malting rice, we see." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "We are too." I said, "Oh." And he said, "We're malting 20 metric tons at a time. What are you malting?" I said, "I'm not open yet." And he said, "Oh, well, we're doing 20 metric tons." I went, "Okay." I said, "It's nice talking to you, but I guess I'm exiting stage right." And he said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "I can't compete with you." I said, I'm going to be really small starting out." He said, "Oh, we don't have to have a malt war. We can work this out. We can teach you to roast dark roasts." And all this time I figured that I was going to have my malt house was going to be for me only. And I was going to completely control it. I was going to just sell beer. And so he convinced me through talking a number of times that I should do the roasting. And he found out that I was already roasting. He said, "Well, you already know how to do it. You need to get up and running, because we're not going to do dark roast because it's too small of a batch to be worth it for us." He said, "You're perfectly situated to do all the colored malts." And I went, "Okay." And so I got the malt house up and running before the brewery, because the brewery took more licensing. And the malt house is my main business. The brewery is very small, never has grown, more or less just showing that it's possible to brew beer. And I have, a small following in the Chico, California area, but I don't have distributors or anything like that. I barely have the time to brew. Malting is so fast. So
Yeah. Tell us about, you're in Chico, right? So the Sacramento Valley, is there already a big rice industry that's built out, so you had easy access to that grain?
Right. Yeah. So the Sacramento Valley, the main portion, I shouldn't say the main portion, it depends on what the soil types are. A large portion of the Central Valley was mucky, heavy clay soils, and it was very difficult for them to grow any other crop. And then they finally realized they could grow rice, and so all those areas have been shifted over to rice. And occasionally people try to grow wheat or barley, and they end up with a mess, because the plants can't take being that wet. They can't drain the fields enough for other crops. And so rice is in, probably 80% of the main Sacramento Valley crops, except for strips where there was some other type of material came down. One area from the gold mining, they were hydro mining these whole hillsides up in the foothills, and all that stuff came down to the valley and left a layer of really nice soil. So those areas have the trees, mostly walnuts and almonds, and then some fruit trees. But like I said, there's a lot of rice grown in this valley.
I was reading through the story on your website where you talk about how rice had a bad reputation in the brewing industry, and it reminded me of in my younger days, like the college days, where you would go out and get a 24 pack of like Schmidt Ice, and we always used to refer to those as like the rice beers, right? So did you have a hard time with the stigma of beers that were made with rice?
It's
From
never going to go away. I'm convinced of it. People still say, well, you're brewing Budweiser then. It's like, well, no, not really. Budweiser is using, milled, polished white rice that's just broken. And it's a byproduct of the food industry. They sort out all the brokens and they don't sell that for food. And it gets sold as what they call brewer's rice. And they're going for alcohol with no flavor whatsoever. And it gets used in quite a few of those mainstream beers. Budweiser, Coors uses a lot of rice. Yeah. So and people say, well, what about the Japanese rice beers? I said, well, they're still barley based. People go, are you sure? It's like, yeah, I'm pretty sure. So, yeah. So anyway, yeah, I fight that all the time. And then they say, well, how do you get any flavor? And I said, well, I malt it and I roast it, just like they do barley. It's not all that different. And I said, the flavor profiles are slightly different because it's different grain, but I'm hitting similar type of roasts. And I don't know, I think there's still room for new malts. You've probably seen I have a few new biscuit malts that were actually mostly suggestions by either homebrewers or gluten-free breweries suggesting I do something, make a malt in between two that I already have. So.
Yeah, speaking of that, I don't know if anyone that's on I know that I've used each of the different versions of biscuit rice, the 4L and was it 15 and the 18?
15L and 18L, yeah.
I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in and give their experience with using those malts. I use them with Ondia Pro and seem to have really good results. And the 4L specifically has this great smell when you mill it. It's fantastic, right? So anyone else out there use those grains yet?
Are we talking about just biscuit or are we talking about rice beers?
The new ones, the new biscuits.
Yeah, I don't have experience with the new biscuits, but I use biscuit in every recipe of our beer.
Yeah. So the 4L is a lighter version of the biscuit. It's just barely starting to hit that flavor that the biscuit has. It's not as strong. And I had quite a few people say, well, biscuit's great, but it's a little bit sharp, they were saying. It's like, okay. So I went for Brian Koldzinski, Gluten-Free Homebrewing, suggested I do something in between a pale and a biscuit. So I did this, light biscuit 4L. It's, I think it's curious. I think it has a place. It might be a replacement of pale, since everybody's using enzymes anyway. We're not so tied to having any enzyme activity, even though, especially since rice is limited to begin with. But then the 15L is darker than the regular biscuit, and the 18L is quite a bit darker. I'm not sure of the 15L. I've tried it, and I'm just not sure about it. The 18 in small quantities seems to go really nicely in lagers. I seem to like it. People have tried a couple of beers I've made with the 18L just as a small portion, and they've come across quite well.
I mean, I find it translates really well, biscuit, in commercial recipes because of the fact that you're using so much base malt in the first place to get the fermentability, that it itself becomes a good character malt that really creates a flavor profile that is very akin to two-row.
All right.
So what
I find that it doesn't really give too much color either, at least in the commercial scale. Like it, you know, our two beers that are currently in stores are pretty tan pale.
Yeah.
well, it's a blonde and an IPA, right, Bob?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I'd say that the IPA, we use crystal rice in there, so it does have a nice, little bit of a more amber, towards an amber, but like, you know, kind of like your typical West Coast IPA, because that's basically what it wants to be. It's funny though, because like the amount of biscuit that we use in our blonde gives a slight balance due to the fact that it gives a slight roast hint. I think Ben Fowler has had our blonde, and that was one of his comments. I was like, huh, that's got to be the biscuit, because I only use corn and pale millet otherwise in that recipe.
We were talking a few weeks ago, Jim, and you had mentioned that going back to the other maltster, they called you from Canada and said, hey, we're going to produce all this. And you had mentioned that when you were initially getting started that you were talking about getting the equipment to be able to produce the amount of grain that you wanted. And wasn't it something that where you basically had to make it yourself because all of the equipment that's out there is like giant sizes of like football fields and things like that?
Right. Yeah. So at the beginning, I knew of two craft malting companies. One in New York, I think it is, and then one in Reno, Nevada. And that was all I could find at the time. And I just called up a manufacturer of malting equipment and just said, hey, you know, I'm looking for some equipment. And after about 5 minutes, he said, who are you? And I told him my name, and he said, what's your company name? I told him. He said, I've never heard of you. I know everybody in the malting industry. Who are you? I said, well, I'm a little startup. And then he goes, what scale are you talking about? And I told him, and he just started to laugh, just laughing his head off. And he finally said, oh, I'm sorry for laughing, but do you realize the smallest piece of equipment that we make is the size of an Olympic-sized pool? That's the smallest. He said, you're going to have to make all your own equipment. There's just no way around it. And he said, maybe somebody will get into it later on. And there are now some companies that are making scaled stuff. And as it turned out, I was able to find some smaller equipment, but it was so highly technologically for testing purposes that there's no way that you could push enough grain through it and pay for it. The equipment was so expensive that it was just for big malting companies to do test batches. So, and the one guy I talked with, he said, well, you just need to buy like 5 of them. I said, there's no way to push enough grain through any one of them to make it worthwhile. I said, there's no way. I can't do that. And so we did. I designed pretty simplistic stuff, a stainless steel tank that they call a Saladin box. It has a perforated raised floor in it, so I can flood it and drain it without losing grain. And I can also run air up through the grain, through that perforated, false bottom. So that's how I got started. We built one. It's an ugly thing, god awful ugly, but it holds water, and we got under production. And now I've got the newer version, which more than doubles my production, pretty similar design. It's just a stainless steel box, but larger. And so most of the equipment has been built. Like I said, if things continue going the way they are, I'm going to have to probably go for something much bigger and much more automated. And then I'll be looking at one of the companies that is actually making this equipment. Hopefully they're still in business. I don't know how many.
You're gonna get rid of your swimming pool, is what you're saying?
What's that?
So you're gonna get rid of your swimming pool and replace it with a new malting piece of equipment?
Yeah, so I started out, my first malting bed is 2/3 of a ton. And I just graduated out of that to 1.5 tons at a batch. And I may have to start looking at either purchasing something larger scale or having something built. Depends on the price. I've got a equipment manufacturing company right next door. I've gotten into a really good relationship with them. They rebuilt my little roasting machine, was the first thing they did, and they did a really nice job on it. And that machine is making me money. And then they finished off my big malt bed, and they're currently building me a 1-ton vacuum cleaner, basically. It's going to be a batch vacuum system with a dump bottom, so I can suck up a bunch of grain and move it with the forklift and dump it. And seems pretty silly, but it's going to improve my life dramatically. We'll be able to move stuff a lot faster and with a lot more ease.
How long does it take to vacuum up 1 ton of grain?
Well, I don't know yet. I'm hoping it's going to be like 1 or 2 minutes. It's going to have a 4-inch vacuum hose and a massive vacuum. And yeah, I'm sure you guys will see it if you look at my Facebook. When I get it, I'll probably be posting about it. But I'm really looking forward to that piece of equipment.
Nice. So you started out as a home maltster, and I know that Peter's done home malting, and some other folks have attempted that. I tend to just shy away from it because there's grouse and Eckert. You guys just, I can get it shipped right to me, right? But in other parts of the world, it's just not feasible to get that delivered. So what's your advice for, home malting? And I think there's a lot of issues with mold and mycotoxins and things like that you got to be careful with. Do you experience those types of issues in your production facility, and did you experience that when you were learning how to do this yourself?
So I had some bad experiences when I was getting started. The biggest mistake that I had when I was doing 5-gallon batches is that when I dried the grain, I didn't get it quite dry enough. And it did not store well. It got moldy. So I'm very particular about getting down to as close to 0 moisture as I can, because it even when it gets bagged in the bags that I use that are supposed to be pretty airtight, it still takes on moisture. In a real humid area, it may suck in quite a bit. And of course, the weight will go up. But I'm bagging at somewhere between 2 and 5% moisture, I believe, just to be sure that I don't have any mold issues, because that would really play badly, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I don't know, Peter, if you want to pipe in about your experiences with mold issues and things like that on a home malting scale.
I think I only had a mold issue once when I was trying to germinate at an inappropriate temperature, because it was I didn't have the equipment to precisely control the temperature at the time, but it was a very hot summer, and something went wrong. But I totally understand that many people who try home malting, their fear is that during the germination, the soaking phase, before they reach a successful germination, they have to soak it and aerate it so long that actually mold starts growing faster than the germination happens. And I understand, I read on some forums that they use, I don't know if they do this on the home scale or in professional barley malting, but they might use hydrogen peroxide. Am I saying correctly? Yeah. But I don't think I would experiment that without the appropriate knowledge on the home scale. Yeah, okay.
Okay, yeah. So with mine, I initially started with regular city water, which is chlorinated, and I figured I wouldn't have any troubles, and I pretty much haven't. And then I had one brewer that was a super taster. He said, "That chlorine's coming through." He said, "You gotta get rid of that. No chlorine, man. I won't buy your product." And so I now everything runs through a activated charcoal to strip the chlorine out. And I've not noticed any issues since I converted over. It's been several years now that I've been doing that. Yeah, it's real touchy. You don't want to be in the steep germination too long, but you got to be there long enough, and then you have to get it dried down fairly quickly to avoid any of the other issues.
Basically, my solution to overcome this or get ahead of this was to I actually do soaking at a fairly cold temperature. So the water, when I soak the grain, is I'm actually mostly experimenting with the rice as well lately, and I soak it at around between 5 or 10 degrees Celsius, and my thinking was that would somehow slow down at least the forming of mold, and then right after this cold soak, I ramp up the temperature to around 28 Celsius degrees, and that's how I germinate. And like this, it happens fairly quickly. So I do like about 24 hours for soaking. I say about because I'm still sometimes experimenting and trying to figure out the best. And then, so after 24 hours of soaking, it only takes, I think, about 2 or 3 days to grow the acrospires.
Yeah. So with my operation, I'm getting in probably the highest quality rice in California, Sacramento Valley. I'm bringing in rice that's been cleaned twice, and I clean it again, and getting rid of all of the small unfilled seeds because they can cause trouble. And then yeah, so it's really clean seed by the time I get to start malting with it. So I think that cuts down on a lot of the issues. When I've used rice directly from a farmer, I often have some more troubles. Occasionally they can be pretty severe. One batch of rice I got when I was kind of panicked about finding any, I brought in some, and it had disease, smut disease. When I went to clean it, there was black dust came up off all the smut spores. That was a bad batch. I managed to salvage it by cleaning it excessively, and then I used it for one of the roasted malts and didn't do as long of a steep germination process. So I didn't leave it open to quite so much potential growth, and it worked. I have one main source now for my rice, and they understand my situation, and they're a lot better at letting me know, because most of the rice in this valley is actually contracted. You can't get it. It's already spoken for before it's planted. The other portion is most of the rice is produced for food, and that doesn't work for malting. So I've got a company that sells seed rice, and he gives me a good deal because he thinks this is really cool. So and he lets me know when they're going to sell, because the farmers, if the price goes up, even if you have an agreement with a farmer, they sell it and they don't. Oh yeah, sorry, I sold that. I got a good price, so it's gone. It's like, I was kind of hoping to get that rice. It's like, oh, well, sorry. So this one main guy, he's been really good to me. He gives me a heads up when it looks like they might sell, so that I can. And in fact, it just happened. I brought in a set of trailers for the first time. Over 55,000 pounds of raw rice are sitting outside, need to be processed. So that's my big step forward here recently.
And Jim, you were when we talked previously, you had said that in the overall scope of the rice industry, your operation is somewhat it's very small compared to what these farmers are selling their rice to on a contract perspective, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I'm hoping that at some point I will have enough need where I can actually contract a field, a small field, for my needs. And the guy I'm working with, he said, I actually have control of quite a few fields, and there's some small ones. He said, we can work something out. So I'm hopeful, because it's got to be the absolute best rice that I can get, or I have some severe problems. I had one guy, a rice farmer, said, I want you to malt some of my rice. I went, okay. And we worked out a deal, and he brought it, and we got started, and there was something off. I could smell something not great. And I asked him about it. He said, oh yeah, it's fine. It's fine. Fine rice. And just like all the other rice you buy. It's like, so we got done, and he went to brew with it, and it did not work. It was, the flavors, some off flavors came through. And I said, we need to talk about your rice. I said, was it lodged? Was it laying down? He goes, yeah, all rice lays down. I said, no, don't even think about it. Don't use anything that's been laying down on the ground, because it picks up organisms, and it just turns into a mess. And that was a big mess. 2/3 of a ton of dog food.
There's another concern that you have with arsenic, right? So what is there a high level of arsenic in the rice within the Sacramento Valley, or is that a non-issue?
It's a non-issue for us. There was a big scare just before I got started, and such a scare that I went ahead and got a couple of my home brews tested specifically for arsenic. They came back no detectable level. I've since gotten testing kits to test my malt, and I'm not detecting anything. And then during that whole scare, all of the rice growing areas had to submit samples across their region for testing. And California came out at so close to zero compared to especially the Southeast US. They have some problems down there. But we're, apparently the way we grow it, or the soils that we use, and the fact that we never used any arsenal pesticides like they did in the Southeast for cotton back in the day, might be the reason. We're not positive. It might be naturally occurring arsenic in the soil, but we virtually have no issue here.
And so, as far as you know it, you're the only. Are you the only raw rice
It's maltster.
maltster in the entire world?
To my knowledge, at this point in time, I have the only commercial rice malting facility on Earth. I know there are a couple other entities trying to do it, and they've been trying to get information out of me. And I'm afraid I'm not so willing to share, since I actually am the only one. And I figured it out, and why should I, push somebody forward at this point? It's eventually going to get out, but I'm trying to protect my niche for as long as I can.
So you have certain proprietary things that you do within your process that diverge from, say, like malting barley or something else. Is that accurate?
Yeah, there's some differences. Nothing spectacular, but can be pretty important. And so, yeah, one of the big entities is going to figure it out. As soon as I have enough market share, they're going to figure out what I'm doing, and they're going to blow my price. And whether I survive that or not, I don't know. I know it's going to come. There'll be others. I know there's a company in Taiwan that's trying to malt rice, and there's a group in Italy for sure. They're mostly trying to figure out what I'm doing.
You had said, I brought this up as an interesting topic because for gluten-free homebrewers, we have, if one of Eckert, you guys, or Grouse was to go out of business, we would basically lose all of our either rice malt or millet malt that we use today as far as dedicated gluten-free. But I think your comment to me when we talked before was, don't worry about it, someone else is going to figure it out, right? So.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, if I could figure it out, other people can figure it out. It's
but we like you, Jim, so we don't want that to happen, right? So.
No, things look pretty good at this point. I had my COVID scare. April was looking pretty rough, and early May also, and then the end of May ended up being pretty good, and June has been good. So it looks like people are getting back. My main customers right now are the ones that have packaging capability. People that are brew pubs only, I'm not gonna hear from them for a while probably.
And how far away do you ship your product? Like, I don't know if you can say this or not, but I know that, like, I talked to a fellow gluten-free brewer in Australia last night, and he was saying that they get, I know Grouse and maybe even your product shipped in all the way on a boat all the way to Australia. Is it getting shipped all over the world?
So yeah, so I have an agreement, a distribution agreement with a guy that has a gluten-free brewery in Australia, and he's taking care of the Australia and New Zealand market for both selling to other gluten-free breweries and to home brewers. I also have a guy up in Canada that is also distributing. I don't have an official agreement with him yet, but he's distributing to home brewers up in Canada because it's difficult to get shipment across, the international lines. I had a company in England that looked like would eventually get into carrying my product. They then sold to another brewery, and that brewery decided to go deglutenized. So they're gone. And there's another one starting up in the UK, and they're asking the question, well, we might be able to make our model work better if we had a distribution agreement. I said, sure, I'll, if you do what I've asked the other ones to do, which is to, not stop distributing and trying to hold on to it to yourself. If you actually do push the product, then, it's great. Because it's near impossible to ship to somewhere like Hungary at a small scale. But if there is a regional gluten-free brewery or somebody that wanted to carry it and could ship over, a couple pallets at a time, that's where it appears like it might be a break point where they can make it work. That's what guy in Australia does. He buys 2 or 3 pallets at a time.
It's kind of, yeah, it's like everything in Europe I know of, maybe Peter can comment on that, is all gluten reduced, and I think they're kind of locked into that mindset. Whereas, and it's tough because how do you create a market when there's no market, right? So, and it's someone's got to just pony up some cash, I think, to make it happen. I think why there's so many more gluten-free breweries that have popped up in the United States is because you guys exist now, right? If you guys didn't exist, then they probably wouldn't be nearly as many as there are today, right?
Right, and if there were, they'd be mostly syrup based beers on either the rice syrup or sorghum syrup. And so yes, as far as the whole grain, it's I believe the only ones out there are myself and Grouse, and then there's Colorado Malting, but they're not strictly gluten free. They malt other grains, so there's a chance of cross contamination. And I can tell you that when that company up in Canada malted their first batch of 20 metric tons of rice, they sent me a sample and I found barley in it. I found enough barley to be of concern. And they said, we cleaned the whole plant 3 times. It's like, yeah, I'm sure you did. But and so that's why I only do rice. I've had offers to do some roasting and or malting of other grains, barley. One of them was going to be really lucrative, and I turned it down because I specify that I am strictly gluten-free.
So I've worked with Colorado Malting. Just want to say that like all of their gluten-free grades are done in a separate malt house.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, so talking about your grains, specifically the rice malts, there was a big, there's a lot of conversation around the PPG numbers of rice malt in relation to what like gluten-free home brewing said they were, and then with the new enzymes that people have been using, like Ondia Pro, for instance, whereas it seemed like that we were getting way higher extraction numbers of the fermentable sugars out of those rice malts specifically, and maybe there was more an ability to extract those sugars out of those grains than we had actually understood. Have you ever done any lab analysis on that, or do you have any firm numbers as a maltster to provide to the homebrew community?
Not specifically. Unfortunately, the Congress mash, which is what is used in barley, doesn't work for rice, or barely works at all. And so I took this to the maltsters group and at a convention, and they had some high-powered big company malting people there talking about stuff. And I asked a couple of them, and they went, "Oh yeah," they said, "You're gonna have to develop your own testing strategy," and that's a bit daunting to try to figure that out. And I could use the different enzymes, but then I'd be coming up with results from those enzymes and may not represent what you'd get with other selection of enzymes. There's so many enzymes now, and there a couple of them in particular, the Ondia Pro, and then there's the what's the other one I've heard of? I haven't tried it yet, but apparently they're breaking down a lot more compounds. Rice has never been bred for malting quality. It's for food quality. And so there's a bunch of starches, best I can say, that aren't readily broken down by the standard enzymes. And so this, excuse me, the Ondia Pro is getting in and breaking down some of those more complicated, possibly more complicated starches to then release the more fermentable. So yeah, I don't make any enzyme recommendations. I just say, look at what other people are saying and try to discern what would be the best set of enzymes for the end result that you want to get. And yeah, it's complicated. We're basically thrown back into the dark ages of barley brewing. We have, my initial mash regime was extremely complicated decoction mash that was 6+ hours and without any enzymes. And then I was able to get conversion most of the time, but it wasn't consistent enough to be reproducible. And so once I started using the enzymes and starting to pick out different enzymes and different mashing procedures, reduced the time frame dramatically and improved reproduction, replication of the beers. So it's the new enzymes have been a godsend. Yeah.
I mean, just for me personally, right? I was big on the millet brewing pretty much only because of my bad experience with not getting extractable, not extracting any sugars out of the rice malt. So now I started using these other enzymes. I feel like it's good for your business, Jim, right? Because it seems like we're able to get more sugars out of those grains than we were before, right? So I'm buying a lot more rice malt. Just not that it matters to you that I bought an extra 5 pounds of rice malt, but if it adds up to all the other homebrewers out there and then maybe even the pro brewers, then it ends up being a lot more business for you, right? So
yeah. So as things stand, basically when I first got started, people were mostly buying pale malt, buying a little bit of biscuit. Now with the enzymes, it's shifting, and I'm selling less pale malt and more biscuit and some of the other malts. And I think that's because we have the enzymes to break down these complicated starches, and you don't need the pale for any enzyme activity. And so if that's the case, then the pale is just providing mostly fermentable and may not be offering much else. And so yeah, I've had a couple breweries that they don't buy any pale anymore, and we're thinking the light biscuit might be a bit of a replacement to the pale. We'll see. Yeah. Everybody has their own recipes and they're having their different successes. So who am I to say?
So I've talked enough, so let's just throw it out to the rest of everyone that's here. Anyone else have any other questions for Jim on any subjects related to malting in general or anything we talked about?
A quick question. You said you had to make your own malting bed. Did you also have to make your own roasters, or were small enough ones commercially available?
So on the roaster, I had seen what roasters look like. I priced them, and I knew that wasn't going to work. So I was talking to this rice farming buddy of mine who's also he's a junker. He likes to go to junkyards and look for stuff. And so I was describing the machine that I wanted. And he goes, "It's out there." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, he draws me a map and goes, "Go to this junkyard and go to the end of this row. Your machine's right there." And I went, okay. So I drive down to this place and pull around the corner and just went, oh my gosh, that is it. It was ugly as sin. But the basic thing was there. It was a rotating drum, stainless steel drum roasting machine. All of the electronics were shot, old 1960s electronics. All the gas supply stuff was, rotten, but the basic machine was there. And so I bought it for scrap metal price, brought it back to Chico and took it to the guys next door. The owner of the place next door said, well, that's a really tiny machine. You know what we build here, right? These monstrous walnut, machines that are, take up an acre. I said, yeah, it's a tiny machine. And I said, what do you think? He said, I like a little fun project now and then. And so they took it on and they rebuilt it. They rebuilt both the electronics and the gas supply. And it was the first piece of equipment brought into my my facility, and we got fired up. And that machine has been my pride and joy. It is the backbone of this business. It holds about 450 pounds of dry grain for roasting, and yeah, so it does multiple jobs, and it should only do one. It should only roast, and I hope to build similar pieces of equipment to take some of those other jobs off of its needs, so it won't be so much of a bottleneck. It ends up being a little bit of a bottleneck sometimes.
That's awesome.
Did I answer the question there? I don't know.
Yeah. That's great.
Okay.
Any other questions for Jim?
Yeah, I have a question. So obviously you're a great pioneer of in this field, what you do. Have you thought about, maybe a stupid question, excuse me if so, please, but have you thought about monetizing your experience and knowledge? I mean, maybe writing a book or something?
No, I haven't. I am not a writer.
Yeah.
I am. I've been a scientist, all of my working days, and I write like a scientist, and that's not. It's too dry, and I just don't know that I could do it, and I don't know if I could have somebody ghost write it or anything, maybe, but. Maybe someday. I don't know. There's nothing in the near future. I'm too busy malting as fast as I can right now. So, and barely ever get to brewing. I'm hoping to brew this week. I really need to, but I've got demands on the malt house. So.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. And if anybody came to me with an outrageous offer that I couldn't refuse, I probably couldn't refuse it as far as selling out. I mean, everybody has their dollar amount that will turn them.
Right. Thanks.
I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but.
Okay. Yeah, actually, if you allow me another question, I was just wondering, so it's quite interesting that we're talking about rice malts, and I'm using also rice malts here. Basically, mainly my focus has been rice on the I would say the past year, because rice is the easiest I can get. So especially certified gluten-free. And I don't really know, but I think that comes down to the scale of the rice growing operation, so they can allow to use their own equipment for only rice on the fields, I believe. And maybe that's not so much the case with other grains. Especially interestingly now with the pandemic, we actually have a shortage of buckwheat, I believe. I don't know. I don't have any like insider information. It's just I could not purchase the buckwheat I used to. I know it was mainly imported Poland and Ukraine probably.
Mm.
So my focus has been rice, and I have never really seen or tasted professionally malted rice. So I'm wondering, can you maybe describe the characteristics of rice that will um, impart in beer, and how dominant rice can be in beer if it's used with other grains like millet or buckwheat, and what are the qualities that you would look for in beer if it's brewed with rice?
So let's see, where do I start with that? Well, just a little bit of background on the rice that I get has been grown on ground that's grown rice for 100 years because nothing else will grow. That's the only ground I buy my rice from. In addition to that, all the equipment used to plant, harvest, and handle rice is all specific to rice. And so there's almost no way for any glutinous grain to have impact in rice. No other grain can grow in a flooded rice field. They die because they can't handle it. So I believe I have probably the purest gluten-free malt on the market because of that. Any crop that can grow on regular ground where they might have grown wheat or barley at any point in time have the potential to have, small quantities, most likely, of some of the glutinous grains. It's a possibility, not necessarily a definite, but rice is pretty darn pure, and that's just the way it's grown. It's so different from any other crop. As far as what flavor profiles and stuff, I think the people in the club could probably answer your question better than I could. The brewers and home brewers probably have more experience with my malt than I do in the end. Like I said, I don't get to brew very often, and I don't get to do a whole lot of experimentation. I've got a set of probably 8 to 10 experiments that I really want to get to, and I just haven't been able to. One of them is to just test a whole bunch of different enzymes under the same mash techniques and just see if I can discern what's going on. There's one guy, Aaron Gervais. He's starting a brewery down in the San Francisco Bay Area. He's done some small micro mash experiments. I've not looked at all of the information, but he's done a little bit with my rice malts and published a little bit of information. I have no idea whether he has any replicated trials or whether it's just one-time things that he's doing. I don't know. I'm not sure that I answered your whole question, but
yeah, I think so. Thank you. I mean, I think my question will be fully answered when I get the chance to drink your beer and taste your malt. But hopefully that day will come.
Yeah. So if you've not seen, I'm roasting up to really close to a black patent malt in the barley world. It's not quite there. The rice is ready to ignite I'm getting close to those temperatures, and it comes out of the roaster and has actually ignited on me, and I have to quench it with water sometimes. So to get to
you're talking about the gas hog? Is that the gas hog?
Gas hog.
I would say, like, for me personally, like the darker malts that are the rice malts don't seem to impart the same acrid bitterness that the darker millet malts impart. So for those darker malts specifically, I feel like those are a better way to get that color specifically without getting that kind of bitter taste in your beer, right? So
right. And then I do have the dehulled gas hog, which imparts less astringency, is what people have called it. the dehulled gas hog is, I use it, I like it. It doesn't get bought enough for me. To roast a batch is difficult because I need a certain quantity to make the roaster perform correctly and to get an even roast. And then it
I'll
doesn't.
buy more next time.
Okay. So what happens is it sits around, and eventually they're pretty stable. My malts are pretty stable, but eventually they start to go, and it's difficult to do a batch. I need to do at least 200 to 300 pounds at a time to have a decent roasting. So I need the dehulled gas hog's been the most problematic of all the malts. The other ones move fast enough, but I like the dehulled. It doesn't, like I said, I'm making my Doppeldog, which is kind of like a porter more than a stout, and I like it because it has less astringency than the regular gas hog. So.
Any other questions for Jim? I got
Yes,
one. I got one. Go ahead.
Sorry. Hopefully, we'll get into the European market with somebody that will carry it and be a distributor in your generally area, because that's the only way it's going to work. Shipping to Hungary in small quantities just would be impossible.
Great segue to my last question, Jim. Thank you so much. You're just knocking out of the park here. So, give me just an idea of where you think your vision is for Eckert Malting and Brewing. Like, what is the malt house going to look like in like 5 to 10 years? Is it going to be like a couple Olympic-sized pool setups full of malting equipment, or do you like the size you're at right now and just want to stay the same, or what does that look like for you?
I'm likely to be expanding. And if I do, I'll probably shift away from the way I malt to a circular tank that can have an automated rotating set of augers that would do the stirring of the malt. And that's the way they do it in the big companies. And there's some equipment out there in the 3 to 5 ton size. I could see, replacing what I've got right now with one of those as an automated system that would greatly improve my production and reduce the labor on the making of the malt. It's all pretty much hands-on right now, and we're trying to get more and more automated. So you can do automation in these Saladin boxes, what they're called. It's just a different means of doing it, and they take up more room in the end. So if I went with a round tank system, I could probably get more units in my existing building, and then you never know, maybe I would be building a facility. That would be nice. I have a totally different idea of how I would set up something that I could have built, but that's quite a ways down the line, unless things go radically different. And that would be some big player coming to me and saying, we want X amount of malt on this basis. But that doesn't happen. I've had six or seven, contacts by big entities saying, "Oh, we want to buy your malt, and this is blah 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 blah." And in the end, I think they're just trying to figure out what I'm doing. Right. I have no contracts with any big companies. They want to push so much paperwork issues and stuff on me. It's just like, it's not worth it. It's not worth it. I actually like the scale I am now, but I'm willing to grow as the need grows.
Well, thank you. Any other last questions from the group before we let Jim go? I think we've taken up probably more over an hour than we had. But so, Jim, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
It's really fascinating to get a maltster's overview of what's going on and your operation. And so, really, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Well, sure. You all
right,
take
guys.
care, and thank you for having me.
All right, everyone. Have a great rest of your weekend. Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.